Ah, Castlevania. One of my favorite video game franchises of all time. The spooky atmosphere, the monsters, the wall pork chops, and all set against a backdrop of some of the best music in video game history. But what if you've played every Castlevania game and you still want more? Well, today we're going to take a look at some other games that capture the spirit of Castlevania without actually being Castlevania. Some of these you may have heard of, and some, well, maybe not, but hopefully there's at least a few games on this list that will scratch your itch for more Castlevania. First up, Master of Darkness, released on Sega Master System in 1992. Storytime, kids! In the early days of the NES, most of the time Nintendo made companies sign some sort of exclusivity agreement in order to obtain licensing rights to officially produce games for the Nintendo Entertainment System. This means that if you developed a game on the NES, you couldn't also release that game on another console, such as one of the Sega consoles. Yeah, you know that little Nintendo seal of quality? When I was really young, I used to think that stamp meant that there was a room full of little kids somewhere deep within the confines of Nintendo of America, toiling away at all of these games to make sure they were awesome before they got shipped to the rest of the world. Nope. That just meant the company forked over the hefty licensing fees to Nintendo. Some companies said the heck with it and released games anyway. Remember all those weird-looking Tengen cartridges? Never saw a Nintendo seal of quality on those, did ya? Anyway, since Konami was an officially licensed producer of games for Nintendo consoles at the time, that meant they couldn't release a Castlevania game on Sega. Sega's response? Fine, we'll make our own damn Castlevania game. And here comes Master of Darkness. You play as a psychologist, Dr. Ferdinand Social, who is set out to defeat Dracula, although the story is given a semi-modern twist. It takes place in London, where a recent slew of killings have been attributed to Jack the Ripper. However, it turns out Jack the Ripper is actually using the bodies and fresh blood from his killings as part of a sacrifice to resurrect old Count Dracula. You'll battle through 5 creepy levels, eventually making your way to Transylvania to take on Dracula himself. One cool thing is the special weapons are a bit more grounded in reality than Castlevania. For example, you could just find a gun and start shooting zombies. Seriously, why didn't Simon Belmont ever just take a gun with him? Anyway, this game is really good and definitely worth checking out. Well, you can't get much more Castlevania than this, Blood-Stained Curse of the Moon. This was made by Koji Igarashi, who was one of the same guys who worked for Konami and helped make the real Castlevania games back in the day. Curse of the Moon was released as part of a Kickstarter for a modern hack-and-slash title called Blood-Stained Ritual of the Night, and they're both considered spiritual successors to the Castlevania games. Right down to the music, with this game featuring Castlevania composer Michiru Yamane. Heck, one of the playable characters even has a whip. This is probably most similar to Castlevania 3, with branching pathways and multiple characters that you can pick up along the way. Each character has their own special ability that may help open up a different pathway, and there are multiple endings, so there's plenty of reasons to play the game over again. Although the spooky settings and even some of the monsters will look familiar to fans of Castlevania, the boss fights are, different? Definitely a step away from the Hammer horror films. A giant possessed locomotive? Sure, why not? But the boss fights can be pretty brutal, so that should satisfy fans of the 8-bit genre, or piss you off depending on your tastes. This game is available on Steam and in just about every other virtual store, and it's pretty cheap, so it's definitely worth a look. One thing I'll recommend is if you play it on Steam, grab an old SNES controller and then use one of those analog to USB controller adapters and remap all of the buttons to bring back that old school feel. You could use an NES controller too, I suppose, although the Super Nintendo one works a little better for some of the extra special attack moves. And just when you thought it couldn't get any more Castlevania than that, here's Castlevania? But I'm betting you've never seen this version before. Wait, what? Okay, so this is Konami's version of Castlevania that was released on the MSX2 computer system in 1986. In September of 1986, Konami released Akumaju Dracula Castlevania on the Famicom Disk System in Japan, and a month later, They released Akumaju Dracula on the MSX2 home computer system, and they also released this under the title of Vampire Killer in Europe on the MSX2. So at a glance, if you just look at a couple of screenshots, Vampire Killer sure looks an awful lot like a basic port of Castlevania, right? Except that in reality, this is some sort of half-baked remixed Castlevania fever dream. Okay, so the basic platforming controls are the same. You've got your whip, slash enemies, destroy candles and walls to find stuff. Pretty straightforward, and the levels all have similar art designs and even look like their NES counterparts from the original game, but this time the levels are all totally non-linear, and you have to find keys to open treasure chests along the way, as well as big keys to proceed to the next portion of the level. You can even find merchants along the way, and you can use your hearts to buy stuff from them. Kinda like in Castlevania 2, Simon's Quest. Okay, so this game is far from perfect. If you thought the controls on the original Castlevania were stiff, these are even worse. I mean, that's to be expected on most of these old computer games from the time. Also, due to hardware limitations, this game technically can't side-scroll. Each level is just divided up into screens, and then the next screen loads when you get to the edge. Honestly, that's fine for me, and you get used to it. The biggest trouble is these damn bats. They're everywhere, and they keep respawning no matter what you do. So do enemies, for that matter. If you stop to get your bearings in the wrong spot, you'll get beaten to death by a never-ending array of bats or monsters. It's kind of like Ninja Gaiden in that way, and sometimes they don't play fair, spawning right at the edge of the screen to where you can't avoid taking damage. But it is doable. Actually, it's possible to get through the game in 30 minutes if you know what you're doing. Best thing to do is just book it through the levels looking for the big keys, and as long as you keep moving, the respawning enemies shouldn't be too much of a problem. If you've replayed the original Castlevania 100 times and you want to try it with everything you know about the game totally flipped up on its side, well, find a way to play Vampire Killer on MSX2. And if we're letting Bizarro versions of Castlevania qualify, I guess I gotta mention Konami's arcade game, Akumaju Dracula, aka Haunted Castle, released in 1988. I've seen some people say this was the arcade game that inspired Castlevania, but it's the other way around. The development of this game was a bit muddled. It started off as a different game altogether, then they rebranded it as a Castlevania arcade remake, even though it's totally not. The gameplay mechanics are very similar to Castlevania, but other than that, the levels are totally different. Also, depending on which version of the original arcade game you play, it's a ridiculously difficult, no-good quarter-munching bastard. Your character is huge, making it impossible to avoid getting hit, and some of the enemies take off like half your life bar, even in the first level. It is cool seeing a Castlevania game with blown-up 80s arcade-style graphics though, and maybe if you can find the right version, it would be more fun to play. They also re-released this on PS4 and Switch not too long ago, and maybe it's a bit more playable on those consoles, but I haven't had a chance to try them for myself. If anyone has played those versions, let me know what you think about them. Blasphemous, developed by the Kitchen Sink and released in 2019. You play as the Penitent One, a brave fellow with his cool pointy hat and a barbed wire sword who's cursed to roam the desolate land of Sphestodia? Yeah. The Penitent One is the last remaining member of the Brotherhood of the Silent Sorrow, and you're tasked with battling the hellish enemies that inhabit this wasteland. This game is dripping with religious imagery, and the twisted backgrounds are all really neat to look at. The monsters are all highly detailed too, including when they meet their grisly demise. Each time you defeat an enemy, you gain Fervor, a special power that you can use to cast spells. And there's all sorts of other power-ups to find along the way in this very non-linear adventure. If you're a fan of Castlevania's Symphony of the Night, definitely check out Blasphemous. You can play the demo for free right now on Steam. Okay, check this out. What do you get when you cross Castlevania with Ninja Gaiden? Odalus: The Dark Call, developed and initially released in 2015 for PC by Joymasher, and in more recent years the game has made its way onto modern consoles such as the Switch, PS4, and Xbox One. You play as Haggis, a brave warrior who arrives home to find his village burned to the ground and his son kidnapped by an evil cult. Haggis has to fight his way through several levels that look like they could be right out of an NES game with their awesome 8-bit art design, except with way more parallax scrolling. Heck, they even threw in scanline filters and curvature around the edge of the screen to make it feel like you're playing on an old-school CRT, and the music is top-notch chiptune goodness. You also get some very Ninja Gaiden-esque cutscenes as you make your way through the story. This game's a lot of fun. Definitely check it out if you get the chance. Lastly, we make our way back to Konami, but this time it's something I honestly had no idea even existed. Akumaju's special, Boku Dracula, also known as Kid Dracula. So, for a long time in Japan, it was pretty common for developers to release parody games of popular franchises or genres. We had a little bit of that stateside, although to my knowledge this wasn't nearly as commonplace as it was in Japan. The most notable parody series I can think of that you might recognize would be the Space Quest series, which beautifully parodied Star Trek, Star Wars, and just about every other science fiction trope you could think of. Well, in 1990, Konami decided to parody themselves by releasing Kid Dracula, a parody of the Castlevania series. This time you play as Demon Kid Dracula, who wakes up to find that some other demon named Galamuth has usurped his title as the Demon King. So, as these things typically go, Kid Dracula throws a spitwad at him, and then you fight your way through several levels that definitely have some callbacks to the Castlevania franchise. But also, this game actually plays a bit more like Mega Man, where you find special items to help out along the way. And some of the areas look more like they're straight out of Super Mario Bros. 2. This game is, well, it's just adorable, really. Except for... wait, what? Well, that wraps it up for this week's episode of Friday Night Arcade. I swear, I'm not dead. There's going to be more episodes. What are some other games that are similar to Castlevania that you'd like to see covered here on the channel? Or have you had a chance to play any of the games that we talked about in this episode? If so, I'd love to hear about it down below. As always, thank you for watching. Please don't text and drive, and I'll see you next time on Friday Night Arcade.